Daniel Jones sucks. But the Minnesota Vikings defense is also badass. Lots to discuss with the Minnesota Vikings defensive performance versus the New York Football Giants. And it's so hard because at this point in time, like I said at the beginning of the podcast, Daniel Jones sucks. So how can you properly evaluate the Minnesota Vikings defensive performance versus a crappy team and a crappy quarterback? Well, I think this is how. Brian Flores was able to get his guys in the building this past offseason for the Minnesota Vikings. You look at Van Ginkel. You look at Cashman. You look at bringing in Greenard, bringing in Gilmore, bringing in Shaq Griffin. Now, there are still weaknesses on the Minnesota Vikings defense, particularly in the secondary. But like I said on a podcast earlier this week discussing the Minnesota Vikings offense, there is so much more unpredictability, balance with Aaron Jones in the fold for the Minnesota Vikings. With Kirk Cousins last year, it was all Kirk Cousins because Alexander Madison was RB1, and he wasn't very good. Ty Chandler eventually took over that role, but the Minnesota Vikings were still a pass-heavy offense because there was no real dual threat offensively for the Minnesota Vikings, which made the offense predictable. Same thing with the defense. Last year, the only way Brian Flores and the Vikings defense could stop anybody was by sending 6 or 7 guys at the quarterback every single play. And eventually, teams caught on and got exposed because you blitz that many guys, well, you're going to leave guys one-on-one in coverage down the field with crappy cornerbacks, and they're going to get exposed. And that's exactly what happened. The Minnesota Vikings defense couldn't stop anybody in the second half of the season, including a Cincinnati Bengals backup quarterback. Jared Goff looked like a Super Bowl winning quarterback that's won multiple MVPs because the Minnesota Vikings couldn't do anything to stop him. But this season, the Minnesota Vikings have an unpredictable defense because of the reinforcements they added this offseason. You think about what they did against the Giants. Yes, Daniel Jones sucks. And like Jake said the other day, the most cruel thing the Minnesota Vikings may have ever done is lose a playoff game to Daniel Jones and the Giants, which forced the Giants to pay Daniel Jones like a 4-year, $160 million contract and keep him as the starting quarterback for years to come. He's not worth it. He's not even worth it. Even the year that he beat the Vikings, he had 15 touchdowns, 15 interceptions throughout the regular season. Like, that's not that impressive. But he beat the Vikings, so then he demanded a big contract number in the playoffs. But the Minnesota Vikings can now blend blitzing and pulling guys back into coverage because they have defensive linemen that can get after the quarterback. They have linebackers that can cover better, and they have corners that can cover better. The secondary is still the weakness because they're older. Shaq Griffin isn't in his prime anymore. Stephon Gilmore's 34 years old. Harrison Smith, this is probably his last year in the NFL. And Cam Bynum, he's all right. Josh Metellus is pretty good. He can play anywhere on the field. But this Minnesota Vikings defense is legit. Now, I know that they faced off against the Giants, and the San Francisco 49ers are coming to town. But I will be surprised if the 49ers march up and down the field on every single possession. I don't think that's going to happen. The Minnesota Vikings defense can blend blitz and blitz 4 guys. They can blitz 6 guys. There is no specific thing that the Minnesota Vikings defense is going to throw at you, and the opposing offenses don't know this. They don't it's unpredictable. That's what it is. So I'm very excited. And you saw great plays by the Vikings defense. They looked fast. They looked physical. They looked elite. And Van Ginkel had that touchdown. And that was sensational. Van Ginkel or Van Winkle? I don't know. I think it's Van Winkle. Van Winkle. I think his name is Van Winkle. So I'm excited about this Minnesota Vikings defense, and it will be a fascinating watch to see how the 49ers perform at US Bank Stadium. Christian McCaffrey is allegedly going to be back, according to one of his teammates after the game on Monday Night Football. But it's a short week for the 49ers. They're traveling, but at the same time, they just demolished a New York Jets defense that's supposed to be pretty good by scoring 32 points. I don't think they're going to score 32 points against the Minnesota Vikings. And when you take into consideration last year, the crappy Minnesota Vikings defense that it was, the 49ers struggled to move the ball up and down the field. And they went to the Super Bowl last year. So you would think, not that this means anything, but you would think that there is a chance that the Minnesota Vikings defense could do it again. Now, it doesn't necessarily mean because they performed well against them last year that they're going to do it again this year. But with better players around them, with better defensive guys on the squad this year, it would make sense. So, it's a tough evaluation whether to buy into the Minnesota Vikings defense playing spectacular against a Giants team in which they only allowed 6 points, which was really only 3 points because C.J. Ham's fumble gave the Giants a free 3 points. It really should have been 7 points, but the Minnesota Vikings defense stopped them. So really, in totality, the Minnesota Vikings defense only gave up 3 points because the offense surrendered the other 3 points. So I'm excited about it. I think it's legit. I don't think it's top 5 legit, but it's definitely not bottom 10 legit. But it's definitely not bottom 10 either. So pay attention to the Vikings defense because they're fast, elite, physical, and good. So the one weakness is the Minnesota Vikings cornerbacks and just their age. We'll see how they hold up as the season progresses because they're not in their prime anymore. And that's the big question mark on the Minnesota Vikings defense. So hit that subscribe button right there, and thank you for making this podcast part of your day.